Okay, let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are very thankful for this new day, for the promises in your word, for the way that you work in our lives, and for the things that you teach us from the scriptures. And we just ask, Lord, that as we open your word, as we look at Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 in a little bit more detail, we ask, Lord, that you can guide our minds and direct us, help us to sort out truth from error. And we pray, Lord, that each person, that you can work in their lives, that you can help us to seek truth at all costs. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we're looking at the June 1996 article entitled The Glorious Land. The modern glorious land. It's a nice big picture of the United States detached from the rest of North America. And that way. And again, that disclaimer with the Acts 17:11 reference, which 17 times 11 is 187. So I always find that interesting. So after we had looked at the Josiah Litch's and Uriah Smith's understanding of Daniel 11, verse 40, we obviously have to move on to verse 41. And we had looked at how Litch particularly tried to fulfill all those events using this literal interpretation of Egypt being the king of the south and Syria being the king of the north. So that problem still persists when it comes to looking at the glorious land itself. So that's what this article is addressing, the glorious land. And this was a battle that Jeff waged or that went on in Adventism. And I think it was probably one of the biggest issues that was hindering his publication of his interpretation of Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. I don't know if there's, other reasons why, but at least it became the battleground, so to speak, for this interpretation that he had. So now I don't know how much people were trying to argue Smith's view. I don't know if that was really the problem because, I wasn't there and Jeff has never really gone into detail why people were taking this position. But the glorious land being the United States seems to me something that's quite obvious. Shouldn't have been a problem for any Seventh-day Adventist understanding scripture. But we're going to look at his arguments. They're very sound, but they also really shed light upon some of the things that we've been talking about. And especially as we try to look ahead to this issue regarding atheism and what we see happening now in the United States. So I think this article comes at the right time in our study. It says, "He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon." Daniel 11, verse 41. In previous articles of this series, we have identified the king of the north as the papacy. I'm convicted that Daniel 11:41 identifies the next spiritual area of conquest for the king of the north as the glorious land. The word, translated as glorious, is defined in Strong's Concordance as in the sense of prominence, splendor, as conspicuous, beautiful, goodly. In agreement with the above definition, this word is sometimes translated as goodly. At times it is used to describe ancient Palestine ancient Israel's land of promise that flowed with milk and honey. This was the land which Moses so ardently longed to enter, yet was forbidden. I pray thee, let me go over and see the good land that is beyond Jordan, that goodly mountain and Lebanon. Deuteronomy 3:25. The great ruler of nations had declared that Moses was not to lead the congregation of Israel into the goodly land, and the earnest pleading of God's servant could not secure reversing of his sentence. He knew that he must die, yet he had not for a moment faltered in his care for Israel. He had faithfully sought to prepare the congregation to enter upon the promised inheritance. Patriarchs and Prophets 469. The goodly land was a promised inheritance designed to fulfill a specific purpose for ancient Israel. In Egypt, their taste had become perverted. God designed to restore their appetite to a pure, healthy state in order that they might enjoy the simple fruits that were given to Adam and Eve in Eden. He was about to establish them in a second Eden, a goodly land where they might enjoy the fruits and grains that he would provide for them. He purposed to remove the feverish diet upon which they had subsisted in Egypt, for he wished them to be in perfect health and soundness when they entered the goodly land to which he was leading them, so that the surrounding heathen nations might be constrained to glorify the God of Israel, the God who had done so wonderful a work for his people. Unless the people who acknowledged him as the God of heaven were in perfect soundness of health, his name could not be glorified. That's the SDA Bible Commentary, Volume 1, 1102. God's law must be exalted, his authority maintained, and to the house of Israel was given this great and noble work. God separated them from the world that he might commit to them a sacred trust. He made them the depositories of his law, and he purposed through them to preserve among men the knowledge of himself. Thus the light of heaven was to shine out to a world enshrouded in darkness, and a voice was to be heard appealing to all peoples to turn from idolatry to serve the living God. With great power and with a mighty hand, Exodus 32:11, God brought his chosen people out of the land of Egypt. He sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They showed his signs among them and wonders in the land of Ham. He rebuked the Red Sea also, and it was dried up. So he led them through the depths. Psalms 105, 26, 27, 106, verse 9. He rescued them from servile state, that he might bring them to a good land, a land which in his providence he had prepared for them as a refuge from their enemies. He would bring them to himself and encircle them in his everlasting arms. And in return for his goodness and mercy, they were to exalt his name and make it glorious in the earth. So you can see this connection always that Sister White is using, this good land, this promised land, and also the exaltation of God's name that is going to occur because of this. The Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. He found him in a desert land and in the waste howling wilderness. He led him about, he instructed him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. As an eagle stirreth up her nest, fluttereth over her young, spreadeth abroad her wings, taketh them, beareth them on her wings. So the Lord alone did lead him, and there was no strange God with him. Deuteronomy 32, 9-12. Thus he brought the Israelites unto himself, that they might dwell as under the shadow of the Most High. Miraculously preserved from the perils of the wilderness wandering, they were finally established in the land of promise as a favored nation. Prophets and Kings 16 and 17. Palestine was designed by the Lord as a first fertile and prosperous land, capable of easily supplying all the temporal needs of ancient Israel. The Lord included in his providential design Palestine's location at the crossroads of the ancient world. This central location facilitated Israel's ease of interaction with mankind. as they sought to preserve among men the knowledge of himself. God purposed to raise up a favored nation who would be the depositories of his law. If they would have upheld the terms of the sacred trust, they would have exalted his name and made it glorious in the earth. To accommodate this holy purpose, he designed a special land of prosperity, divinely located on center stage in the theater of the world. The definition of the word glorious aptly describes Palestine and its purpose in the sense of its prominence and beauty. So you can obviously see where he's going here, in that we have what Israel was, what its purpose is, and that this is going to obviously be transferred to the United States. Daniel speaks of the glorious land twice in chapter 11. He first mentions this in Daniel 11:16, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his will, and none shall help him, or none shall stand before him, pardon me, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. So we're going to know that this is Palestine. Or Uriah Smith, commenting on this verse, states, after putting an end to the war, Pompey demolished the walls of Jerusalem, transferred several cities from the jurisdiction of Judea to that of Syria, and imposed tribute on the Jews. For the first time, Jerusalem was, by conquest, placed in the hands of Rome, that power which was to hold the glorious land in its iron grasp until it had utterly consumed it. Daniel and Revelation, page 247. Uriah Smith and other Adventist pioneers correctly viewed Daniel 11:16 as describing pagan Rome's conquest of the glorious land of ancient Palestine. Pagan Rome's invasion and victory is prophetically illustrated by the symbolic use of the word hand. Now, this is an interesting argument that he's going to present that I've never really thought about before. But just before we go into his argument about hand, so we can see that you can't just simply say literal before the cross and spiritual after the cross, because even though, we can do that, in one sense, and we can do that here because we know that the glorious land here being Palestine is before the cross, right? Because this is talking about the conquering of literal Israel. But as we talked about before, when it comes to this prophecy, there are some things that are literal prior to 538. So for certain things, 538 parallels the cross. So here he's not making this argument about literal and spiritual yet, which he could have, but he's thinking a little bit differently, and he's going to make this argument about the word hand. So I think it's an interesting argument. The hand is used prophetically to identify forced subjection. This symbol of subjection can describe either a literal or spiritual subjection, depending on the context. So in trying to deal with literal and spiritual here, he's going to deal with this idea of hand. And so I just think it's kind of interesting. I've never have thought of this argument. Okay, understanding the symbolic meaning of hand as force identifies how the mark of the beast will be applied. In Daniel 11:41, we see papal Rome spiritually conquering the glorious land of the United States in connection with the description of those who escaped his hand. We will look more closely at the prophetic use of the word hand in our next article. Okay, so he's just introducing it here, and it's going to be in more detail in his next article. So what is he saying, though, here about hand? What is he, just in this little bit of it? That hand can be what?
Control, forced subjection.
Yeah, and that would be spiritual, or, right? Where literally it would be, so understanding it as force, the symbolic meaning of a hand as force. And then we would look at being escaping out of his hand. Obviously, we wouldn't take that literally. So, and I haven't read the next article where he goes into detail about the word hand, but he's bringing up spiritual and literal in just the fact that we can use a word in a way that's symbolic, or we can use it in a literal sense. Daniel 11:16 portrays ancient Palestine being literally invaded, as ancient Israel was literally conquered by pagan Rome. Daniel portrays pagan Rome as standing in Palestine, for pagan Rome literally conquered the land. In Daniel 11:41, papal Rome spiritually conquers the modern glorious land, and as it does so, it is portrayed as entering that land, not standing in it. The glorious land of ancient Israel was literally conquered by pagan Rome, but the glorious land for modern Israel will be spiritually conquered by papal Rome. Sister White counsels that all the experience of ancient Israel has important lessons which modern Israel should carefully consider. So again, as I continue to look at this, and you'll see as we go through this discussion here, that Jeff is setting up an understanding regarding Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, that is a spiritual, and by spiritual, I don't mean like some kind of nefarious, airy-fairy sort of spiritual, just basically symbolic application. And that's why I don't understand why we took the position we did regarding Raphi and Panium, though we're going to get back to that. All the experience of Israel has a lesson for us. All who are living in the last hours of time, we should carefully consider their course of action and the dealings of God with them. So the course of action, the experience of Israel, should be carefully considered, and the way that God dealt with them, and their and then imitate their virtues, while we shun those acts which brought upon them his displeasure. The mighty God of Israel is our God. In him we may trust, and if we obey his requirements, he will work for us in as signal a manner as he did for his ancient people. Now, signal a manner, does that make sense? Signal a manner, or I don't know if that's a type.
We're dealing with 19th century English.
Yeah, I would usually use the word single a manner, but
No,
I just wondered.
he wants to call this out as a special manner.
Okay. It should be the
Yeah,
most
a public display.
Okay. It should be the most earnest study and continual effort of modern Israel to bring themselves into close and intimate relationship with God. Signs of the Times, November 11th, 1880. I was pointed back to ancient Israel, but two of the adults of the vast army that left Egypt entered the land of Canaan. But two of the adults of the vast army that left Egypt entered the land of Canaan. Their dead bodies were strewn in the wilderness because of their transgressions. Modern Israel are in greater danger of forgetting God and being led into idolatry than were his ancient people. So this warning is interesting. I mean, we're looking at modern Israel. So Jeff is showing the difference between little ancient Israel and modern Israel. But there are some other points that are connected to that. Conviction and thorough repentance was required of ancient Israel in order to meet the standard of God. No less does God require of his people in our day. There must be genuine hard work and repentance and humiliation in order to come under this covenant care and protecting love of God. Unmistakable evidence is given that God is a jealous God, and that he will require of modern Israel, as he did of ancient Israel, that they obey his law. For all who live upon the earth in this sacred history, all who live upon the earth, for all who live upon the earth is this sacred history traced by the pen of inspiration. Signs of the Times, May 27, 1880. For 40 years did unbelief murmuring, and rebellion shut out ancient Israel from the land of Canaan. The same sins have delayed the entrance of modern Israel into the heavenly Canaan. In neither case were the promises of God at fault. It is the unbelief, the worldliness, unconsecration, and strife among the Lord's professed people that have kept us in this world of sin and sorrow so many years. So there's one of those statements, Selected Messages, book 1, page 69, where Ellen White shows that if God's people had acted differently, Christ would have come. And so we're now in the wilderness for the same reason that the Jews who came out of Egypt were. When Sister White states the experience of ancient Israel has a lesson for us, and that this sacred history has been traced for all who live upon the earth, she recognizes the land of promise as an important part of the parallel between ancient and modern Israel. So traced as upon a line, carefully consider the next quotation. While primarily addressing the United States, Sister White first quotes Jeremiah 3, verse 18 to 19. This verse specifically refers to ancient Palestine as the land which Israel had been given for an inheritance. Sister White then identifies a specific favored land which has been divinely provided for modern Israel. So let's read the statement. In those days, the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel, and they shall come together out of the land of the north to the land that I have given for an inheritance unto your fathers. But I said, how shall I put thee among the children and give thee a pleasant land, that's the glorious land, a goodly land, a goodly heritage of the host of nations. And I said, thou shalt call me my father, and thou shalt not turn away from me. Jeremiah 3, verse 18 and 19. When the land which the Lord provided as an asylum for his people, that they might worship him according to the dictates of their own conscience, the land over which for long years the shield of omnipotence has been spread, the land which God has favored by making it the depository of the pure religion of Christ, when that land shall, through its legislators, abjure the principles of Protestantism and give countenance to Romish apostasy and tampering with God's law, it is then that the final work of the man of sin will be revealed. Signs of the Times, June 12, 1893. So, and one of the things in this is, through its legislators, abjure the principles of Protestantism. So we know that this is the connection of Protestantism with the Romish and give countenance to the Romish apostasy. So this is talking specifically about the Sunday law. We would agree with that. Though the inroads to the Sunday law have already occurred. That is, we don't have the image of the beast test, or maybe we're entering into that. But definitely in 1996, what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union was the beginning of this. It wasn't the end of it. We noticed earlier that God's promise to ancient Israel was that they might dwell under the shadow of the Most High as he encircled them in his everlasting arms. For modern Israel, the United States is the land which was provided as an asylum for his people. It is the land which has been favored by the shield of omnipotence. Sister White specifies the land 4 times in this passage, accentuating the geographical aspect of the United States. The United States was designed by God to accomplish the same purpose for modern Israel as did Palestine for ancient Israel, providing God's people with many spiritual and secular advantages in order to accomplish God's mission on earth. The Lord has done more for the United States than for any other country upon which the sun shines. Here he provided an asylum for his people where they could worship him according to the dictates of conscience. Here Christianity has progressed in its purity. The life-giving doctrine of the one mediator between God and man has been freely taught. God designed that this country should ever remain free for all people to worship him in accordance with the dictates of conscience. He designed that its civil institutions, in their expansive productions, should represent the freedom of gospel privileges. Right, so this is separation of church and state that she's talking about. The United States is a land that has been under the special shield of the omnipotent one. God has done great things for this country, but in the transgression of his law, men have been doing a work originated by the man of sin. Satan is working out his designs to involve the human family in disloyalty. The United States was designed to be a modern day land of milk and honey in order that God's people could proclaim the final warning message to the world. Its prosperity, principles of government, and position as the great melting pot for the different nationalities of the world were designed to provide the same evangelistic advantages that were provided to ancient Israel through the glorious land of ancient Palestine. At this point, we have failed to take full advantage of his providential favors. I'm on the wrong page. Providential favor, just as ancient Israel failed. Time is rapidly running out. It is in vain that the declaration of eternal truth has been given to this nation, to be carried out to all. Is it in vain that the declaration of eternal truth has been given to this nation to be carried out, to carry to all the nations of the world? God has chosen a people and made them the repositories of truth, weighty with eternal results. To them has been given the light that must illuminate the world. Has God made a mistake? Are we indeed his chosen instrumentalities? Are we the men and women who are to bear to the world the messages of Revelation 14, to proclaim the message of salvation to those who are standing on the brink of ruin? Do we act as if we were? Selected Messages, Book 1, page 92. So it's interesting when you read this, she says, you know, this eternal truth has been given to the nation. Could you not put there given to this church in there, that the closeness of the United States to Adventism in the responsibility that it bears, I think is quite striking a feature that we have here with the United States. That the United States is not just some country. It is a country, a nation that God has established as much as he established ancient Israel.
Amen.
And we can see that when she's talking about the United States here, she says God has chosen a people and made them the repositories of truth, weighty with the eternal results. Now, we could look at that and say, well, she's talking about Seventh-day Adventists, but she's talking about Americans. That is, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is God's denominated people, but they're in the country of the United States. That's the land in which Adventism was to flourish, and then to go to all the world with the three angels' messages. As we studied the previous articles in this series, the war between the southern and northern kings in Daniel 11:40 establishes 1798 as the starting point for the conflict between the forces of Catholicism and atheism. The war portrayed in that verse is not resolved until the chariots and ships, symbolizing the economic and military power of the United States, are brought into alliance with Catholicism. The United States and the papacy formed an alliance as they recognized the USSR, the modern king of the South, as a common enemy. This alliance was formed not only to secure the freedom and nations which were enslaved and dominated by the USSR, but also to battle against the philosophy of atheism. So now the interesting point here which Jeff has brought out other times. So when we look at 1798, and Ellen White makes this clear, that's when the United States rises in 1798. That's when it comes up. That two-horned beast rises in 1798. You know, we could go back to 1776 and the American Revolution and so forth. But it's in 1798 that really Ellen White marks the rise of the United States. Now, some people have tried to say, well, that's when we got our military, and that's when we first actually are recognized by many countries as an independent nation. So even though we Americans, I'm including myself with you guys, recognized ourselves as independent of Britain before that. It's not until 1798 that other countries in the world recognized that independence completely. Now, some countries before and some after. But that's the point where Ellen White marks it. And we know, what have we done with this period of time from 1798 to the Sunday Law? What have we paralleled it with from the book of Isaiah?
The days of one king.
Yeah, so the days of one king. So that 70 years, which are the days of one king, which is from 609 BC to 539 BC, the period in which Babylon is ruling the Levant. We can also recognize that that's a symbol of the United States. So we went through that when we were studying the book of Ezekiel as well. This alliance parallels the activities of Clovis, King of France. So this is an important point where he's showing the end from the beginning. This alliance parallels the activities of Clovis, King of France, who turned away from the predominant religious profession of his nation in order to come to the aid of Catholicism in its battle against Arianism. The alliance between Clovis and Catholicism resulted in the assault against the Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Heruli, which consisted not only of a war against the three nations, but also a war against the religious philosophy of Arianism, which was held by these three nations. Once the alliance was formed, Clovis and other nations of Europe, which had formerly been pagan, began the military conquest which placed the papacy on the throne of the world. The work of plucking up the three horns of Daniel 7 was carried on from 508 until the last of the three horns was removed in AD 538. At that point, the abominable, desolating power of the papacy was set up. Now, one of the things we talk about is we talk about literal and spiritual. And if you look at this history here, and you take Clovis, and then you apply the story of Clovis as a parallel to our time, are you comparing literal and spiritual, or are you just paralleling two histories? I don't know if that question makes sense.
Restate it.
Okay, so what we
See
have,
your question, but I don't have an answer.
okay, so the question has to do with, if we're taking nations from the Old Testament, let's say Edom, Moab, and Ammon, we're going to look at them literally, how they were applied, and then we're going to take those as a symbol and apply them at the end of the world. Can we do the same things with histories that are not ancient in that sense? They're not Old Testament. So can we take the story of Clovis and what happened with those three nations, and can we apply them symbolically or spiritually? Do they become types, is the question that I'm asking, even though
Yes.
yeah, okay. Yeah, so we have an answer, yes. So what does this tell us about literal and spiritual? Like, a spiritual application. Okay, Ryan?
Well, we can make a spiritual application of the French Revolution in our time, and that came way after both the cross and 538.
Yeah, right.
So
Yeah, and when we're taking something like nations, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Heruli, as three obstacles, and we went back to ancient Rome having three obstacles as well. So is that the same as literal and spiritual, or is it something else? Or how does it differ? Why is it that we're making this distinction as literal and spiritual before the cross and after the cross, But here we appear to see this happening even after 538, though this is kind of, this here is before 538, the French Revolution's after 538. But, God parallels the end and the beginning. So how is this different, or is it different when we take the history of these three nations being uprooted, and now we're going to apply that principle spiritually rather than literally? Or are we applying it literally, just to different powers?
I think it's at least literally.
What's that?
I think it's at least a literal application.
We're making a literal application, or can we make a literal application? Or is that
It
a
just
literal application?
Yeah, on the basis of the repeat of history, we see 3 walls now that Jeff mentioned
Yeah, so he talks about the
that
three.
will be taken down so that he can rule the whole world.
Now we have one of those walls, which is actually tied to the literal wall, right? So the wall, the Berlin Wall, was an actual literal wall. But isn't that more a type or an antitype, or it's a spiritual application rather than a literal application? Because it's not so much about the literal wall.
Yes, it has symbolic meaning.
Yeah, because even that wall is symbolic, right? It was a symbol that was being torn down, because they could easily just have left the wall up and just open the gates. But the symbol was torn down. But the other walls, like the wall between church and state, for instance, is not a literal wall. We use it as a symbol. And so I think this idea of literal and spiritual has to be, we have to recognize when we apply it and how we're applying it. So I wouldn't say that we're applying it literally. You can say there are 3 obstacles, but it's different when we're applying it at the end of the world. When you're using the previous lines as types and you're now applying it, you have to be careful that you're not too literal. And I think this is part of our problem. Now, I don't also want to get into the error of just spiritualizing everything away. So for instance, in Millerite history, one of the issues that came with the Great Disappointment was there was a few different views in which they should address what happened. So there was a group that said that Jesus came spiritually to the earth. And that idea persisted, and it was later used by the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, the group Seventh-day Adventists, they were kind of accused of that when they had Christ go to the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary, that as if that was some kind of spiritualistic interpretation. But some people just rejected the idea that the prophecy was fulfilled because it wasn't fulfilled in the literal way that they were looking at it. For instance, the error that Miller made regarding the earth being the sanctuary, what was the problem with that interpretation, other than that it was wrong? But what was the problem of how they came to that conclusion?
Is the sanctuary not holy?
Yeah, the sanctuary is holy.
So has the earth been holy since the fall in Eden?
No, but they were looking for the cleansing of the sanctuary. So they were looking at the cleansing of the earth by fire.
I understand the point, but when we address these type of situations, as Father Miller had, we have to look that there are points that while he had a concept, he did not have a full understanding.
Yeah, to me, it seems like an error that he shouldn't have made, that he should have recognized that the earth was not the sanctuary, that God's church was the sanctuary on the earth, because we're at the temple of God. but he also should have recognized the sanctuary in heaven. There's lots of verses that he should have seen that, not just
Even
Well,
even one of Miller's rules was that if you, after you understand the symbols, then you can apply them literally.
well, if the application can either be made literal or figurative, if it does no damage to the meaning.
right.
But the
But
problem here, the
yeah.
problem here is that the application is damaging the meaning.
Right. And that's where I'm struggling right now, as I'm starting to look at how we should have understood the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south in our time. Definitely what happened in 1989 was the correct application of that prophecy. So to see the king of the south as being the Soviet Union and the king of the north as being the papacy, with the United States as its army, that's a correct application. That doesn't do any damage whatsoever to Miller's rules. It's consistent. But we can see that, and Jeff here dealing with the glorious land, he's being consistent. He's recognizing that this is a spiritual application. It's spiritual Israel. It's not literal Israel. It's the spiritual land of Israel. It's not the literal land of Israel. But then when we're going to look at how we've tried to look, when we examine our understanding of what our failure was regarding the USSR, that it came up to the head, we then made the assumption that meant it was Russia. And I'm examining the idea that it's not Russia, but it's the battle against the philosophy of atheism. That is what is continuing. It's about the philosophy of atheism, not about the nations themselves, where the Battle of Raphia needs to be understood. And that's quite a change. It would be just as much a change as what we saw happen with the idea that the earth is no longer the sanctuary, that we have to look to the sanctuary in heaven. Would people agree with me on the parallel there?
Yeah, it looks good to me. The nations are just the vehicle for the philosophy.
Yeah, and that's why the Soviet Union and even France had the characteristics. That's why they are the king of the north and the king of the south, because there are actual powers involved, actual nations involved in these situations. So, but those nations are there because of the philosophies that they're teaching, not for their literal aspects that would have marked them as the king of the north and the king of the south.
So our dilemma is, where did the atheism and heathenism go after the breakup of the USSR?
And it appears that it's gone to the United States.
Yes, unfortunately.
That's the way that I would look at it. But I would not have made that interpretation 2 years ago. And I'm still, cautious about it, right? But that's what I'm examining. And I can see it here in Jeff's writings, in the statements that he takes from the Spirit of Prophecy. So now we're going to look at this alliance between Clovis and the Vatican, which led to the 1260-year rule of the papacy, and ended with the affliction of the deadly wound in 1798. So you look at this alliance that begins at the beginning of the 1260, it's at the end. So can we look then at that alliance that's happening now and make an application that's going to be enlightened by understanding this? Okay, so you had a comment there, Pat?
Yeah, when Jeff wrote this, we still had Protestant churches, I believe, but no church calls themselves Protestant by now.
Well, there might be a few odd churches, with emphasis on the word odd. But we can see here that in 1996, there's no way that Jeff or anybody could have foreseen the situation unfolding as it has unfolded over the last few months. That is, I couldn't have seen it 2 years ago. I mean, maybe I could have if I was more enlightened, but I didn't see it 2 years ago. And I definitely wouldn't have given this scenario in 1996. So I think that's what's happening, is as we get closer to this event, we're starting to see that we can look back at the past understanding and see the part where we were not able to discern, but that everything here is laid correctly. That is, his arguments are being laid soundly, but it's just the conclusion that he draws, or what he sees from those arguments, that is weak. So let's look at this one point here, the alliance between Clovis and the Vatican, right? So you have this happening at the beginning of the 1260-year rule of the papacy, right? Ends with the infliction of the deadly wound in 1798. Now, Clovis's France empowered the papacy at the beginning of the 1260 years, and Napoleon's France used its power to bring an end to the same 1260 years. What began with an alliance ended with war and captivity. The finishing of the first epoch of papal rule in 1798 is followed by a retaliation against the King of the South, which initiates the final epoch of papal rule. This ending is historically located in 1798, and with the future retaliation is symbolically identified in Daniel 11:40. In this verse, describing the final outcome of the alliance of Clovis, we see the United States symbolized as ships and chariots. It begins to repeat the infamous historical record of the alliance of Clovis. The tyrannical authority of Rome was brought to an end in this verse. And yet, in this same verse, we see the beginning of Rome's eventual return to the power of her former position. In the historical setting of 1798, Sister White also addresses the United States. So we're going to read this, and then we're going to go back and look at what he's saying and what Sister White's saying. What nation of the New World was in 1798 rising into power, giving promise of strength and greatness, and attracting the attention of the world? The application of the symbol admits of no question. One nation, and only one nation, meets the specifications of this prophecy. It points unmistakably to the United States of America. Again and again, the thought, almost the exact words of the sacred writer, has been unconsciously employed by the orator and the historian in describing the rise and growth of this nation. So what Jeff had done earlier in last week's article, where he took these literal descriptions in the news media of what happened in 1989, we're seeing Ellen White doing the same application in 1798. Yeah, Pat? Is that Pat? Somebody made a comment.
No, not me.
Oh. Okay, I just heard somebody's voice. Okay, the beast was seen coming up out of the earth. And according to the translators, the word here rendered coming up literally signifies to grow or spring up as a plant. And he had two horns like a lamb, Revelation 13:11. The lamb-like horns indicate youth, innocence, and gentleness, fitly representing the character of the United States when presented to the prophet as coming up in 1798. Among the Christian exiles who first fled to America and sought an asylum from royal oppression and priestly intolerance were many who determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. Their views found place in the Declaration of Independence, which set forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted, every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. So one of the things that people have tried to argue, the secular world has tried to argue, is that America is not a religious country, but it is actually a Protestant nation. That is, it is opposed to Rome. That's one of the founding principles of the United States. And that's one of the problems the new movement had, besides many other things. But when they were trying to argue that the United States was not a Christian nation, which totally contradicts the spirit of prophecy and also really contradicts history. The oppressed and downtrodden throughout Christendom have turned to this land with interest and hope. Millions have sought its shores, and the United States has risen to a place among the most powerful nations of the earth. It is worthy to note here that Sister White sets forth the book of Daniel and Revelation as books which complement each other. When we recognize the United States prophetically in Daniel 11, verse 40 to 41, we line up this testimony with Revelation 13, like a hand in a glove. We know verse 40 is placing us historically at the time of the deadly wound. Revelation 13 is the testimony about the beast with the deadly wound and the beast which uses its power to heal the head of the beast, which had received the deadly wound. These verses in Daniel project themselves perfectly into Revelation 13. They also squarely line up with the spirit of prophecy testimony concerning this time period in history. So what Jeff is saying, and correctly, is that what happens in 1798 is paralleling what happens in 1989, just as what happened at the beginning of the 1260 parallels the end of that prophecy. So this is like a chain that connects these periods of time together, the time of the papacy, which is 1260 years, and the time of the United States, which prophetically as a symbol is the 70 years or the days of one king. And when we look at the beginning of the United States and then the end of the United States, so to speak, that those events in 1989 are also the beginning of something, are they not?
Yes, and the end shows the beginning.
Okay, so if they're the beginning of something, if we take 1798 and we see this reform line, so this is what we understand in this message. We have a reform line that begins in 1798. And that reform line is about the giving of the first and second angel's message that leads to the arrival of the third angel's message. And then we look to 1989 and we can see that there is a parallel to 1798, and then begins a reform line that's going to have a repeat of the first and second angel's messages, leading to the empowerment of the third angel. And the question that I have is, can we look at the beginning of these things to tell us about how they end? Because one of the things that we have done is we've seen the king of the north and the king of the south in a battle in 1798 and a battle in 1989. And are we looking for a battle with the king of the north and the king of the south to be repeated again?
Yes.
Yeah, we are, right? And in so doing, we have to recognize what that battle is. Now, when we recognize that the idea that we could take, and this is rather involved, but if we just go back and think about it, what happened? We came first to the conclusion that the first 4 verses of Daniel 11 could be applied to our time. That is, we could line them up with our kings. We could take those kings of Persia and we could line them up with our kings. And we're all familiar with that, at least we should be. And we could see that Trump lined up with Xerxes. But then the application that was being made was that, Trump was going to be also typified by Alexander the Great. So that's one of the issues. But the other thing that came as we started to look at this is the study of Daniel 11 led to a revelation that what had happened, that we had language that was similar to the Sunday law in Daniel chapter 11 itself, and that this was also a history that was going to be repeated. So we could then take all of Daniel 11 and take these various lines in Daniel 11 and line them up. And one of the things that happened when we did this, is that Raphia and Panium lined up with our history. So we saw Raphia and Panium, which were historical events, as being symbolic of a battle between the king of the north and the king of the south that was going to happen in our time. And so what did we do with the king of the south? Who was then the king of the south?
We were saying it was Russia.
Yeah, we were saying it's Russia. And the reason we said it's Russia, and again, I'm not saying that we're wrong. Like, I'm not taking this position, I'm just examining it. But the reason why we said it was Russia, and what we were wrong about, is that Russia, or Moscow, was the head. And so we looked to Putin as being the king of the south, and he's going to come against the United States. And this made sense in a lot of ways. It was very logical. And we can parallel this, I think, to how Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45 was understood by the Millerites. That is, they were looking at current events. They were applying these things in a way that really didn't follow the rules completely. So at least this is my suggestion. So then we would say, well, Russia would be the king of the south, and the United States would be the king of the north. And so the Russia and the United States would have these battles. So Russia would win the first battle, and then the United States would win the next one. But if we are going to take this and apply it spiritually, would we not look at what the head was not so much a king or a person, but was the idea or the philosophy that actually made Russia the king of the south and France the king of the south in the first place? Wouldn't we take atheism and hedonism and say that those are the characteristics, those are the philosophies that are typified by Sodom and Egypt, and it's these philosophies that are going to be in battle? And that
Before you go on,
yeah, okay, yeah,
as recently as 3 hours ago, there are articles, like news articles, of Russia building up its forces along the Ukraine border and in the Arctic.
Right. And that's not a problem, because just because Russia's doing that, remember, when you look at the application that the Millerites were making in their time regarding Turkey, was there literal, can they look to actually literal battles between Egypt and Syria and France?
Yes.
Right. So the thing that you have to be careful about is, just because we have some indications that we could look at things literally and we see things happening, doesn't mean that we would then decide that battle has to be a literal battle. Now, one of the things that Jeff did initially when he started looking at this, when he presented it in Alberta, is we had Colin going up to him and saying, I think it's going to be a hot war. And Jeff was saying, well, I just think it's going to be a war dealing with, computers or something like that. It's going to be an information warfare that's going on. And I think Jeff was reluctant to look at it as a hot war initially. He was seeing it more as a war of ideas that was going to occur.
I thought it was
He even put a couple of articles about Putin and Trump on the Prophecy Helps 101 website, which I've subsequently taken down.
You took down which? Why would you take anything down?
The two articles about Trump and Putin.
Okay, how come you took them down?
They no longer seem to be accurate.
Well, yeah, I would never take anything down though, but anyway, that's your choice.
I thought it was a war of technology is what Jeff was saying.
It's the same thing. So, yeah, anyway, I wouldn't have taken them down. I think we need to keep our history up there. I don't like scrubbing things just because we think we were wrong about something. But anyway, that's your choice, not what you want to do there.
I just watched 2 of those videos from July 2017, and it also seemed like he was alluding to a pandemic attack of some kind.
Yeah, which, yeah, he put the pandemic in there. And of course, and he put it between Raffi and Panium, which the dates we then developed for Raffi and Panium were November 9th and July 18th. And that's when the pandemic occurred between those events. So I think there's a lot of significance there. I don't think, see, and that's part of the problem. And when we're looking at this and we're looking at an unfolding of truth, it's not an attack upon what Jeff was teaching. It's just that sometimes the conclusions or the assumptions that we bring into our perspective limit what we can see. That is, I wouldn't have seen what we see right now in the United States, because what we were looking for was a Republican president to repudiate republicanism and Protestantism. That's what we were looking for. And that president was going to be Trump. But as events unfolded, we could see that Trump wasn't acting as a dictator. He actually believes in the Constitution. He believes in the principles of the Constitution and the rights there. So he wasn't going to be the one that did that. But then we see, on the other hand, this power, which is globalism, taking over the United States, which is really socialism. What we see being manifested right now. One is we saw a revolution about class warfare. Basically a civil war is happening in the United States right now. And it's going to get worse. But the ones who are winning that war are not the Protestants and the Republicans. It's the globalists that are winning that battle. And the question is, will they continue to win that battle or not? And what does prophecy say about it? So if we're going to understand these events that are happening in the United States correctly, we would then have to understand prophecy correctly. And that's why I'm saying I'm not making a decision on this. I'm examining this to try to say, could it be that the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south is a battle between philosophies in the United States itself? And do we have a basis for that conclusion? And the United States, which then goes to the world. And we had the Ellen White statement earlier in the previous article that really seemed to be indicating that. But Jeff had just merely applied that to the rise of the Soviet Union. But she's talking about the final events at the end of the world that are worldwide, that begin in the United States, in where the battle is won. Once the United States loses that battle and republicanism and Protestantism are no more in the United States, then we have the image to the beast set up. And the other part of the puzzle is me understanding for the first time how communistic the papacy is, that it's socialistic. It has the same values, really, as communism had, as the French Revolution had. And these values are not something new. They're something that have been in the papacy for a long, long time. So these are the things we're examining.
I think your assessment looks good.
Okay,
After
well,
reading the first quarter of Tim Robbins' book, Ecclesiastical Megalomania, I understood that the uh, Roman papacy was just religious communism.
right, exactly. Okay, so let's go on and read here. In 1798, atheism established its capital within the realm of France. So this is an important point. The capital, what is the capital? What is the capital referring to? What's the biblical term?
The head.
The head. So in 1798, and it's actually prior to that, but atheism had established its head within the realm of France. So France is a country, but the head is atheism, ultimately migrating to Russia. So the head moved from France, atheism, and it moved to Russia, eventually growing into the empire of the USSR. In 1798, Catholicism became a slain beast, removed from its geopolitical position as king of the earth, and yet ultimately destined to return to that very position which she had lost. So you have atheism and communism, or Catholicism, pardon me, atheism and Catholicism. And you see France, it's going to move to Russia. Catholicism, it's become a slain beast, but it's going to be elevated once again to that position that it had. Atheism and Catholicism are both portrayed as being a process of change. Somebody have a comment there, or somebody just have their mic on and not realize it? Okay.
I remember a series of meetings, I don't remember the year, when Russell Williams in the UK presented that
2004.
the harlot of Revelation moved from head to head through history, and that was kind of a struggle to follow that.
Okay, so that's an interesting idea. So this harlot, because the question is, I mean, where does atheism, I mean, we know it comes from Egypt, but socialism, that idea, where is its root? I mean, we think, of course, Karl Marx brought about, the Communist Manifesto, and so, it's something that comes from, it's something modern. But we know it goes back to Egypt. But what is the root of it?
It's the principle of paganism that William Miller pointed out. It goes all the way back to the creation of the world.
Yeah, it's something that goes all the way back, and I would say to the first lie given to our parents in the Garden of Eden, to which the gospel is to counteract and expose this philosophy, because it's the root of it is do as thou wilt, that you are a god, right? That's really the root of it. Now, it has these different manifestations historically on how this is understood, but really it goes back to that very root. And just looking here. Yep, see you, Jeff. Yeah, so now we have this atheism and Catholicism are both portrayed as being in the process of change. So too is the United States. For in 1798, the United States was still the young lamb-like beast of Revelation 13. In its youth, the United States has been sustained by the purity of its Protestant doctrine. But given time, it will eventually cease to be a lamb, and it will begin to speak as a dragon. These three entities are tied together in Daniel 11:40. And by verse 41, the United States, through the passage of a national Sunday law, will complete the metamorphosis of Revelation 13:11. And beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. He had two horns like a lamb, but he spake as a dragon. And the speaking of the dragon, we know, has to do with through its legislation, through its laws, right? So this is about the Sunday law. So Jeff is focused upon the Sunday law. prior to the fall or to the attack on the World Trade Center. So we have the fall of the Soviet Union. The World Trade Center attack is future. A lot of things are still future. He hasn't seen what's happening in the United States. The role of Islam hasn't been fully understood. I don't know if it still is. But inspiration portrays three specific powers in Daniel 11, verse 40, as well as identifying a historical starting point. The three powers are placed within a setting in which their relationship is seen to be that of three political powers which are striving for the mastery of the world. But underlying the hunger for temporal power, we also find three conflicting spiritual and philosophical perspectives. So he sees the three powers here as the King of the North and the King of the South, and the United States supporting the King of the North, because that's the military power. Beginning with the counterattack against the atheistic power of the King of the South, the sequence of events which will unfold through the following verses describes the growth of the spiritual power of Catholicism, which prevails through the support of the forces of apostate Protestantism. The spiritual victories represented have a literal counterpart, as the nations of the world are step by step brought under the dominion and ultimate control of the papacy, as sustained and supported by the United States. So from 1996, you're Seventh-day Adventist, you're looking at what's just happened. 1989 is really recent history, and you're looking forward and you're seeing the Catholic Church becoming very prominent through Pope John Paul II. And what you see is that we're going to continue moving towards this Sunday law. And we see the moral majority, evangelical Christianity, apostate Protestantism through the more liberal churches as well, which first make their connections with the Catholicism, joining the hand. They've joined hands with the papacy, and we're going to just see a Sunday law coming. But as we look at what our understanding is of the battle between the King of the North and the King of the South being repeated, that is, 1989 is not the end of the battle between the King of the North and the King of the South, but it takes a new turn. So when we're going to take the history, the repeat of history, because we're going to take this history of Daniel 11, and now we're going to repeat it in our time. The question is, how do we do that? How do we do that correctly without making the mistake of taking things, applying things literally that we shouldn't? And that's part of the question that I have. So the glorious land of the United States is the next target for spiritual conquest by the papal King of the North. So the question is, how is it targeted? Right? Because what we normally think is, the Protestant churches are targeted. But what we have neglected to understand is what has happened to the United States. Because back then we wouldn't have seen this. We wouldn't have seen the insanity that is occurring in the US right now.
It's been targeted.
Yeah.
It's been targeted philosophically.
Yeah. And that's what I would say. And he says it's the next target for spiritual conquest by the papal King of the North. So he's going to quote Ellen White. She says, "The greatest and most favored nation upon the earth is the United States. A gracious providence has shielded this country and poured upon her the choicest of heaven's blessings. Here, the persecuted and oppressed have found refuge." Is that true still today?
Well,
Yes.
yeah, that's why we have this flood over the southern border. But Jeff mentions there's three powers, but and then only goes on to mention the United States and the papacy, but he doesn't put a lot of energy into not spiritualism, atheism after this point.
Yeah. Now I would say that the persecuted and oppressed are not finding refuge, because the persecuted and oppressed exist within the United States. That is, people have documented the persecution that exists, and we see it here today in the United States, dealing with people who have differing points of views in regard to free speech. So is free speech being suppressed in the United States? Yeah. People are persecuted. People lose jobs over beliefs, which should not happen in the United States. So people can believe certain things and express those beliefs, and they will be fired from their jobs and receive no protection from the law because they're not the popular beliefs. So we're seeing the same type of persecution, not to the point that people are being killed on the streets yet, but we see that spirit of persecution existing in the United States. Here, the Christian faith in its purity has been taught. And of course, we know that Protestantism has fallen. And even the church that's supposed to stand for God, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it's losing its purity. This people have been the recipients of great light and unrivaled mercies, but these gifts have been repaid by ingratitude and forgetfulness of God. The Infinite One keeps a reckoning with the nations, and their guilt is proportioned to the light rejected. A fearful record now stands in the register of heaven against our land. But the crime which shall fill up the measure of her iniquity is that of making void the law of God. Between the laws of men and the precepts of Jehovah will come the last great conflict of the controversy between truth and error. The laws of men, the precepts of Jehovah, these things are going to be in contrast. Upon this battle we are now entering, a battle not between rival churches contending for supremacy, but between the religion of the Bible and the religion of fable and tradition. The agencies which will unite against the truth and righteousness in this contest are now actively at work. So this is in 1899 that Ellen White says these agencies that will unite against truth and righteousness in this contest are now actively at work. So what are these agencies?
The reform movement.
So which reform movement?
Like the National Reform Society or whatever.
Okay. So you can
called
look at those types of things. But would we also say what's going to happen in the French or the Russian Revolution is one of those agencies as well? That atheism is one of these agencies, because she's not talking about organizations. She's talking about agencies as in agents, ideas, philosophies. At least that's the way I take
Yeah,
it.
even not to give credit to Tess, but we did examine these revolutions when she was speaking to us.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily giving credit to Tess. One of the things that I find is when there is a truth that is hidden, Satan will come with a counterfeit beforehand to basically vaccinate us against accepting that truth. That is, he will mix it with error. One is so that it's more attractive, or he mixes truth with error. The truth makes the error more attractive, but it also makes that truth less attractive. And so that people will often throw out the baby with the bathwater. So a lot of things that Tess was saying were true, but they were mixed with error. And that was to shield us from seeing the truth that she was presenting. It was a way to damage the truth. So there's a lot of things that she said were correct, but there's things that she was saying that were wrong. And we need to be able to recognize those. The people of the United States have been a favored people, but when they restrict religious liberty, surrender Protestantism, and give countenance to popery. So do we see a restriction of religious liberty in the United States right now?
Yes, but it depends upon how you define religion.
Right, but people have beliefs that if you believe them, I mean, even if you just look at the idea that you can shut down churches, that's a restriction of religious liberty.
Yes, and that's basically a Catholic principle. A piece of popery is the restriction of personal liberties.
Right, and then surrendering a Protestant.
Religious liberty.
And we see that the Democrats are much more connected with Catholicism than the Republicans ever were. I mean, I know people try to make a case that, you know, some of these people have been studied in Jesuit universities, which doesn't really mean much to me personally, because Jesuits have all kinds of universities and they may teach you principles, but it doesn't make you an active Jesuit necessarily. But anyway, surrender Protestantism, and the principles of Protestantism are definitely being surrendered, that there is not a protest against Rome, and they give countenance to popery. The measure of their guilt will be full, and national apostasy will be registered in the books of heaven. The result of this apostasy will be national ruin. So, you know, my position on this is that we've seen this apostasy happening in what has happened in the last few months. Our land is in jeopardy. The time is drawing on when its legislators shall so abjure the principles of Protestantism as to give countenance to Romish apostasy. The people for whom God has so marvelously wrought, strengthening them to throw off the galling yoke of popery, will by a national act give vigor to the corrupt faith of Rome, and thus arouse the tyranny which only waits for a touch to start again into cruelty and despotism. With rapid steps, are we already approaching this period? Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4, 410.
Can I say something?
Yep.
So she keeps talking about how the legislators will abjure Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
I know that some people get upset when you say this, but in a certain extent, the Bible is a political treatise. Like it has political aspects to it, political principles, like personal freedom, personal responsibility. And so does atheism. And it's the opposite. It's socialism and state control.
Yeah.
And that's what's being abjured, is the political principles of the Bible.
Yeah, and that would be individual rights.
Yeah.
Now, a Catholic principle is collective rights, right? So when you have group rights and you have individual rights, group rights always trump, no pun intended, individual rights. And we saw this in Canada when we had a Catholic sort of Prime Minister, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. That's the father of the president, of the present Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. But he established, they repatriated our Constitution from England and gave us the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the Charter of Rights and Freedoms entrenched group rights. And once you have group rights, individual rights disappear. Group rights are more a Catholic idea. Individual rights, the Catholic Church hates individual rights. It doesn't believe in freedom of conscience or any of these things that we think of as individual rights. And that's because group rights, it's kind of hard to explain without getting into some details, but they're always going to trump individual rights. So if you want to protect individual rights or the rights of people, you need to have only individual rights protected. You should never identify groups. That is, the government justice should be blind. It should be blind to race. It should be blind to class. It should be blind to group identity or any kind of identity other than just the individual. Jeff goes on here, both references to the glorious land. So he's just summarizing his argument. In Daniel 11, identify the entrance of Rome into the land that serves as a haven or refuge for Israel. In agreement with Daniel, Sister White also places her information of the modern day glorious land in connection with the papal king of the north entering into it through the passage of a national Sunday law. The history of ancient Israel presents an important parallel that modern Israel must prayerfully consider. One lesson of utmost importance in this series is the recognition that just as God provided the glorious land of Palestine for ancient Israel, he has also provided the glorious land of the United States for the Seventh-day Adventist people, his modern Israel. We have been assigned the task of proclaiming the final warning message to a world which is fearfully ignorant of the issues involved and of the impending catastrophes connected with these final moments of probation. Ancient Israel was given a similar assignment and failed. The signs of the times, in connection with the unfolding light of prophecy, demand that we as a people begin to remove any obstacles from our personal experience which might prevent us from being among those who loudly proclaim this final message. So, and he's going to go on looking at Daniel chapter 11, verse 40 to 45. But the principle that he set up right now is that the glorious land is the United States. And in understanding that, when we start to look at this battle that goes on, because who is it that's, we'll see this later, that is, you start to read Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, you start to see things that we never saw before. Even though we saw them, but we saw them through a certain lens. And now when you look at him, it actually becomes much clearer. And the key here is understanding the spiritual nature of this warfare that's now being waged. So.
And he notes particularly Seventh-day Adventist people as being in the forefront of that.
Yeah, well, one of the problems that, the Adventist Church has bought into Black Lives Matters, and all kinds of other things. I wouldn't be surprised, in the next General Conference session, if there is not some concession made to homosexuals and transgenders, that because already within the North American division, these concessions are being made. So there's just so much pressure, because once you've made that step, I remember back in 1988, I was at a triennial session in Alberta, and it was quite a bizarre situation. We had, they set up their nominating committee to nominate people, and then they present, are going to be on the conference committee, and so they had already had all these nominations, and then this sort of rebellion erupted at this triennial session where a group of Black ministers felt that the conference committee did not represent proportionally the number of Black people and the number of women that existed in the conference, and that they wanted to have the committee be proportional. Now, normally you would just pick the best people for the job. You're not going to worry about, well, what color they are or what gender they are. You would just find the people who could do the job the best. And so I was rather surprised by this, that the Adventist Church and what they did is they actually changed the whole makeup of the conference committee, because they wanted it to represent, I can't remember what, equal representation or something like that, proportional. They had a word for it. I can't remember the word. But it's kind of a crazy idea. But I thought, well, where's this going to end? I mean, if you're going to even make that first step, it's going to get worse. And so as the values of the world continue to change, the church has already gone on that boat, and it has to go along with the values of the world. It can't continue to fight against them unless it recognizes what direction it has gone and repents and changes that direction. But I don't see that happening, especially since, they have this new generation who are taking over the church and its institutions, who really have no respect for the Bible or spirit of prophecy, and who aren't converted. So that's a problem I see happening with the Adventist Church in that context as well. So both the United States itself and the Adventist Church are in apostasy to the truth. So we're in a bad shape in the U.S. right now. Anyway, any final thoughts? And that was a good point there. Okay. Well, let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you again for this study, for the time that we could spend together, for the discussion that we've had. And Lord, we again ask that we can be guided by you, that we can be careful in how we look at these things. Help us to understand them correctly. Forgive us, Lord, for our sins, our neglect in doing the work that you've given us to do. And help us to focus, Lord, upon the little tasks each day. Give us strength in those small battles with self that always occur, and help us to trust fully in you and to feel the peace and the joy of your salvation. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we ask these things. Amen.